The Fairies on the GUMP. Down by St. Just, not far from Cape Cornwall and the sea, is a small hill, on a very large mound would perhaps be the truer description, called the GUMP, where the small people used to hold their revels and where our grandfathers and grandmothers used to be allowed to stand and look on and listen. In those good old times, fairies and ordinary people were all good friends together. And it is because they were all such friends and trusted one another so, that our grandfathers and grandmothers were able to tell their grandchildren so many tales about fairies and piskies and BUCCAS and all the rest of the little people. People believed in the fairies in those days, so the fairies in return often helped the people and did them all sorts of kindnesses. Indeed, they would do so now if folks had not grown so learned and disbelieving. It seems strange that because they have got more knowledge of some matters, they should have grown more ignorant of others, and declare that there never were such things as fairies, just because they have neither the eyes nor the minds to see them. Of course, no one could expect the sensitive little creatures to appear when they are sneered at and scoffed at. All the same, though, they are as much about us as ever they were. And if you or I, who do believe in the little people, were to go to the GUMP on the right nights, at the right hour, we should see them feasting and dancing and holding their revels just as of old. If, though, you do go, you must be very careful to keep at a distance and not to trespass on their fairy ground, for that is a great offence, and woe be to you if you offend them. There was once upon a time a grasping, mean old fellow who did so, and pretty well he was punished for his daring. It is his story I'm going to tell you, but I will not tell you his name, for that would be unpleasant for his descendants. But I will tell you this much. He was a St. Just man, and no credit to the place either, I am sure. Well, this old man used to listen to the tales the people told of the fairies and their riches, and their wonderful treasures, until he could scarcely bear to hear any more. He longed so to have some of those riches for himself, and at last his covetousness grew so great, he said to himself he must and would have some, or he should die of vexation. So one night, when the harvest moon was at the full, he started off alone and very stealthily to walk to the GUMP, for he did not want his neighbours to know anything at all about his plans. He was very nervous, for it is a very desolate spot, but his greed was greater than his fear, and he made himself go forward, though he longed all the time to turn tail and hurry home to the safe shelter of his house and his bed. When he was still at some distance from the enchanted spot, strains of the most exquisite music anyone could possibly imagine reached his ear, and as he stood listening, it seemed to come nearer and nearer until, at last, it was close about him. The most wonderful part, though, of it all was that there was nothing to be seen, no person, no bird, not an animal even. The empty moor stretched away on every side. The GUMP lay bare and desolate before him. The only living being on it that night was himself. The music indeed seemed to come from under the ground, and such strange music it was too, so gentle, so touching. It made the old miser weep in spite of himself. And then, even while the tears were still running down his cheeks, he was forced to laugh quite merrily, and even to dance, though he certainly did not want to do either. After that, it was not surprising that he found himself marching along, step and step, keeping time with the music as it played, first slowly and with stately tread, then fast and lively. All the time, though, that he was laughing and weeping, marching or dancing, his wicked mind was full of thoughts as to how he should get at the fairy treasure. At last, When he got close to the Gump, the music ceased, and suddenly, with a loud crashing noise, which nearly scared the old man out of his senses, the whole hill seemed to open as if by magic, and in one instant every spot was lighted up. Thousands of little lights of all colours gleamed everywhere. Silver stars twinkled and sparkled on every furze bush. Tiny lamps hung from every blade of grass. It was a more lovely sight than one ever sees nowadays, more lovely than any pantomime one has ever seen or ever will see. Then, out from the open hill, marched troops of little Spriggans. Spriggans, you must know, are the small people who live in rocks and stones, and cromlechs, the most mischievous, thievish little creatures that ever lived, and woe betide anyone who meddles with their dwelling places. Well, first came all those Spriggans, then a large band of musicians followed by troops of soldiers, each troop carrying a beautiful banner, which waved and streamed out as though a brisk breeze were blowing, whereas in reality there was not a breath of wind stirring. These hosts of little people quickly took up their places in perfect order all about the Gump, and, though they appeared quite unconscious of his presence, a great number formed a ring all around the old man. He was greatly amazed, but, "Never mind," he thought, "they are such little whippersnappers I can easily squash them with my foot if they try on any May games with me." As soon as the musicians, the Spriggans, and the soldiers had arranged themselves, out came a lot of servants carrying most lovely gold and silver vessels, goblets too, cut out of single rubies and diamonds and emeralds and every kind of precious stone. Then came others bearing meats and pastry, luscious fruits and preserves, everything, in fact, that one could think of that was dainty and appetizing. Each servant placed his burden on the tables in its proper place, then silently retired. Can you not imagine how the glorious scene dazzled the old man, and how his eyes glistened and his fingers itched to grab at some of the wonderful things and carry them off? He knew that even one, only of those flashing goblets would make him rich forever. He was just thinking that nowhere in the world could there be a more beautiful sight, when lo and behold, the illumination became 20 times as brilliant, and out of the hill came thousands and thousands of exquisitely dressed ladies and gentlemen, all in rows, each gentleman leading a lady, and all marching in perfect time and order. They came in companies of 1,000 each, and each company was differently attired. In the first, the gentlemen were all dressed in yellow satin, covered with copper-coloured spangles. On their heads they wore copper-coloured helmets with waving yellow plumes, and on their feet yellow shoes with copper heels. The flashing of the copper in the moonlight was almost blinding. Their companions all were dressed alike in white satin gowns edged with large turquoises, and on their tiny feet pale blue shoes with buckles formed of one large turquoise set in pearls. The gentlemen conducted the ladies to their places on the Gump, and with a courtly bow left them, themselves retiring to a little distance. The next troop then came up. In this the gentlemen were all attired in black, trimmed with silver, silver helmets with black plumes, black stockings, and silver shoes. Their ladies were dressed in pink, embroidered in gold, with waving pink plumes in their hair, and golden buckles on their pink shoes. In the next troop, the men were dressed in blue and white, the ladies in green, with diamonds all around the hem of the gown, diamonds flashing in their hair and hanging in long ropes from their necks. On their green shoe, single diamonds blazed and flashed. So they came, troop after troop, more than I can describe, or you can remember, only I must tell you that the last of all were the most lovely. The ladies, all of whom had dark hair, were clad in white velvet lined with the palest violet silk, while round the hems of the skirts and on the bodices were bands of soft white swansdown. Swansdown also edged the little violet cloaks which hung from their shoulders. I cannot describe to you how beautiful they looked, with their rosy smiling faces and long black curls. On their heads they wore little silver crowns set with amethysts. Amethysts, too, sparkled on their necks and over their gowns. In their hands they carried long trails of the lovely blossom of the wisteria. Their companions were clad in white and green, and in their left hands they carried silver rods with emerald stars at the top. It really seemed at one time as though the troops of little people would never cease pouring out of the hill. They did so at last, though, and as soon as all were in their places the music suddenly changed and became more exquisite than ever. The old man by this time seemed able to see more clearly and hear more distinctly, and his sense of smell grew keener. Never were such flashing gems as here. Never had any flowers such scents as these that were here. There were now thousands of little ladies gathered on the GUMP, and these all broke out into song at the same instant, such beautiful singing too, so sweet and delicate. The words were in an unknown tongue, but the song was evidently about some great personages who were about to emerge from the amazing hill. For again it opened, and again poured forth a crowd of small people. First of all came a bevy of little girls in white gauze, scattering flowers which, as soon as they touched the ground, sprang up into full life and threw out leaves and more flowers, full of exquisite scents. Then came a number of boys playing on shells as though they were harps, and making ravishing music, while after them came hundreds and hundreds of little men clad in green and gold, followed by a perfect forest of banners, spreading and waving in the air. The last, but more beautiful than all that had gone before, was carried a raised platform covered with silk embroidered with real gold, and edged with crystals, and on the platform were seated a prince and princess of such surpassing loveliness that no words can be found to describe them. They were dressed in the richest velvet, and covered with precious stones which blazed and sparkled in the myriad lights, until the eye could scarce bear to look at them. Over her lovely robe the princess's hair flowed down to the floor, where it rested in great shining golden waves. In her hand she held a golden scepter, on top of which blazed a diamond as large as a walnut, while the prince carried one with a sapphire of equal size. After a deal of marching backwards and forwards, the platform was placed on the highest point of the GUMP, which was now a hill of flowers, and every fairy walked up and bowed, said something to the prince and princess, and passed on to a seat at the tables. And the marvel was that though there were so many fairies present, there was not the slightest confusion amongst them. Not one person moved out of place at the wrong moment. All was as quiet and well arranged as could possibly be. At length all were seated, whereupon the prince gave a signal, on which a number of footmen came forward carrying a table laden with dainty food in solid gold dishes, and wines in goblets of precious stones, which they placed on the platform before the prince and princess. As soon as the royal pair began to eat, all the hosts around them followed their example, and such a merry, jovial meal they had. The viands disappeared as fast as they could go. Laughter and talk sounded on all sides, and never a sign did any of them give that they knew that a human being was watching them. If they knew it, they showed not the slightest concern. "Ah," thought the old miser to himself, "I can't get all I'd like to, but if I could reach up to the prince's table, I could get enough at one grab to set me up for life, and make me the richest man in St. Just parish." Stooping down, he stealthily dragged himself nearer and nearer to the table. He felt quite sure that no one could see him. What he himself did not see was that hundreds of wicked little Spriggans had tied ropes onto him and were holding fast to the ends. He crawled and crawled so slowly and carefully that it took him some time to get over the ground. But he managed it at last, and got quite close up to the lovely little pair. Once there, he paused for a moment and looked back, perhaps to see if the way was clear for him to run when he had done what he meant to do. He was rather startled to find that all was as dark could be, and that he could see nothing at all behind him. However, he tried to cheer himself by thinking that it was only that his eyes were dazzled by looking at the bright light so long. He was even more startled, though, when he turned round to the GUMP again, to find that every eye of all those hundreds and thousands of fairies on the hill was looking straight into his eyes. At first he was really frightened, but as they did nothing but look, he told himself that they could not really be gazing at him, and grew braver with the thought. Then, slowly bringing up his hat, as a boy does to catch a butterfly, he was just going to bring it down on the silken platform and capture Prince and Princess, table, gold dishes and all, when, hark! A shrill whistle sounded. The old man's hand with the hat in it was paralyzed in the air, so that he could not move it backwards or forwards, and in an instant every light went out, and all was pitchy darkness. There were a whir and a buzz and a whir, as if a swarm of bees were flying by him, and the old man felt himself fastened so securely to the ground that, do what he would, he could not move an inch. And all the time he felt himself being pinched and pricked and tweaked from top to toe, so that not an inch of him was free from torment. He was lying on his back at the foot of the GUMP, though how he got there he could never tell. His arms were stretched out and fastened down so that he could not do anything to drive off his tormentors. His legs were so secured that he could not even relieve himself by kicking, and his tongue was tied with cords so that he could not call out. There he lay, no one knows how long, for to him it seemed hours, and no one else but the fairies knew anything about it. At last he felt a lot of little feet running over him, but whose they were he had no idea until something perched on his nose, and by the light of the moon he saw it was a Spriggan. His wicked old heart sank when he realized that he had got into their clutches. For all his life he had heard what wicked little creatures they were. The little imp on his nose kicked and danced and stamped about in great delight at finding himself perched up so high. We all know how painful it is to have one's nose knocked, even ever so little, so you may imagine that the old miser did not enjoy himself at all. Master Spriggan did, though. He roared with laughter as though he were having a huge joke, until at last, rising suddenly to his feet and standing on the tips of his tiny toes, he shouted sharply, "Away, away! I smell the day!" And to the old man's great relief, off he flew in a great hurry, followed by all his mischievous little companions who had been playing games and running races all over their victim's body. Left at last to himself, the mortified old man lay for some time thinking over all that had happened, trying to collect his senses and wondering how he should manage to escape from his bonds, for he might lie there for a week without any human being coming near the place. Till sunrise he lay there, trying to think of some plan, and then, what do you think he saw? Why, that he had not been tied down by ropes at all, but only by thousands of gossamer webs. And there they were now, all over him, with the dew on them sparkling like the diamonds that the princess had worn the night before. And those dewdrop diamonds were all the jewels he got for his night's work. When he made this discovery, he turned over and groaned and wept with rage and shame, and never to his dying day could he bear to look at sparkling gold or gems, for the mere sight of them made him feel quite ill. At last, afraid lest he should be missed and searchers be sent out to look for him, He got up, brushed off the dewy webs, and putting on his battered old hat, crept slowly home. He was wet through with dew, cold, full of rheumatism, and very ashamed of himself, and very good care he took to keep that night's experiences to himself. No one must know his shame. Years after, though, when he had become a changed man and repented of his former greediness, he let out the story bit by bit to be a lesson to others, until his friends and neighbours, who loved to listen to anything about fairies, had gathered it all, as I have told it to you here, and you may be quite sure it is all true, for the old man was not clever enough to invent it. The Fairy Ointment. Now I will tell you a story of a very foolish woman whose curiosity got the better of her, and how she was punished. The old woman's Christian name was Joan. I will not tell her surname, for it does not make any difference to the story, and there may be some of her descendants left who would not like it to be known. Joan was housekeeper to Squire Lovel. The name of his house shall be kept a secret too, but I will tell you this much, that he lived a few miles out of Penzance. Now, one Saturday afternoon it fell out that Joan wanted to go to Penzance Market to get herself a pair of shoes, and to buy some groceries and several Christmas things for the house, for it was Christmas Eve, and the squire had a lot of folks coming to supper that very night. So, the weather being fine, Joan started off soon after her 12 o'clock dinner to walk into Penzance to market. Having, though, a great fancy for company and loving a little gossip, she thought she would step in on her way to see if her friend Betty Trenance was going to market too. It would be so nice to have each other's company on the way. Now, many persons in those parts told some very queer stories about Betty Trenance, and amongst themselves some called her a witch and were afraid of her. Joan, though, argued that if she was a witch, there was all the more reason for keeping friendly with her, and if one did not offend Betty, she was always ready to give one a cup of tea or do anything to oblige one. Betty lived down at Lamorna Cove, which was a little way out of Joan's road, but she did not mind that if she could get Betty's company. She walked quickly, though, for the days were short and she had a long way to go, and to be back in time to cook the squire's supper. On her way she met two of Betty's elder children carrying baskets of fish on their backs, and down in the cove she saw all the younger ones at play with the limpets and crabs in the rock pools, and paddling about in the water, but she could not stay to watch them, for she had no time to spare, so she hurried on to the cottage. When she got there, though, to her astonishment, she found the front door was closed and fastened, not only latched either, but bolted. This was such an unusual thing in those parts that Joan was quite startled. At first she thought something must really have gone amiss. Then she comforted herself by deciding that Betty had already started for the market and had locked the children out to keep them from ransacking the place. Just, though, as she had settled all this in her mind and was about to turn away, the sound of voices reached her, and voices talking very earnestly too. Joan looked round her nervously. The voices sounded quite near to her, but there was no sight or sign of any living thing except some seagulls and Betty's old black cat. What did it all mean? Joan was frightened, but her curiosity made her stay and try to get to the bottom of the mystery. She stood quite still and listened very closely. Yes, there were the voices again, plainly enough, but where? She tiptoed close up to the door and placed her ear against the keyhole. This time she heard Tom Trenance's voice quite distinctly. Tom was Betty's husband. He was talking very earnestly to someone too, more earnestly than she had ever heard him speak in her life before. But, try as she would, she could not make out to whom he was speaking, nor what he was saying. This was more than inquisitive Joan could endure. She must know what was going on in the cottage, or she would know no peace day or night for thinking about it. So she made up her mind to knock and knock until those inside were obliged to come to the door. But first of all she thought she would have a peep in through the finger-hole by the latch. So she stooped down and put her eye to the hole, and there she saw Tom sitting on the settle, and after all it was only Betty that he was talking to. Betty was standing beside him with a little box in her hand, from which she took something that looked like ointment, which she smeared over her husband's eyes, and all the time she did it she seemed to be mumbling some verses or something that sounded like a charm. There seemed to be other voices as well, though, and to Joan's great annoyance, she could not see from whence they came. All this put old Joan in a fearful flutter. People had always told her that Betty was a witch, and that Tom had the power of the evil eye, and now she began to believe them. You would not have thought so to look at him, for though they were very piercing, they were handsome hazel eyes, clear and kind-looking, unless he was angered. And then, completely mystified and more inquisitive than ever, Joan went round to the window by the chimney to see if from there she could hear what they were saying. But it was of no use. The door of the cottage was on the landward side, and the windows of the cottage were to seaward, and round the kitchen window was a great bush of honeysuckle and traveller's joy, which prevented anyone getting quite close. And what with the sound of the sea, the singing of the birds, and the shouting of the children below, one might as well have been a mile off for all one could hear. Back tiptoed Joan again, and sat down on the bench outside the house to think. But her curiosity would not let her keep still, so up she jumped again, and peered through the door once more. This time she saw that Tom was standing up, preparing to come out. So not wanting to be caught prying, she tapped at the door, and lifting the latch at the same time, walked in as if she had but that moment arrived. She was so excited by what she was doing that she did not notice that the door opened quite easily now. She went in so quickly, too, that she was just in time to see Betty push something under the dried ferns at the back of the chimney. After saying "Good day," and hearing what she had come for, Tom went out, leaving them to make their plans by themselves. But Betty, though she seemed pleased to see her friend, could not be persuaded to go to market with her. She was very sorry, she said, but she was very bad. She had not been well for days, and she still had a good day's work to get through making ready for Christmas. She was not too busy, though, to make a cup of tea, and Joan must stay and have one with her. And away she bustled to the Towfat, where she had a special case of tea put away. This was Joan's opportunity, and she seized it. As soon as Betty's back was turned, she whipped the pot of ointment out from under the ferns, stuck her finger in it, and popped the pot back again, in no time. But no sooner had she touched her eye with the ointment than, oh, such a pain shot through it! She very nearly shrieked aloud. It was as though a red-hot knitting needle had been run right through her eyeball. And oh, the smarting and the burning that followed. To prevent a sound escaping her, she had to hug and squeeze herself with all her might. She dared not open her lips to speak, and the tears poured down her cheeks like rain. It was lucky for her that Betty had some trouble in dragging the chest of tea from under the bed, for if she had come back quickly, she could not have helped seeing what Joan had been doing. By the time she returned, though, the worst of the pain was over, and keeping up her hand to that side of her face, Joan managed to conceal the injured eye, and Betty was too busy with her fire and her kettle to be very observant. "I'm glad you came in to have a cup with me, and drink my health, it being Christmas Eve and all," said Betty, as they drew up the table. Then, having drunk each other's health, they had a third cup to drink the health of the children. For, as Joan said, there wasn't a healthy, handsomer family in the whole parish. Then they drank the health of the mermaids, for it is always wise to be civil to them. And after that, Joan rose to go. Before she could go, though, she felt she must manage to open her injured eye, which still watered and smarted a good deal. So she rubbed it and blinked and winked until at last she managed to part the lids, when lo and behold, to her amazement and alarm, she saw that the house, which she had thought empty save for herself and Betty, was simply thronged with little people. There was not a spot that was free of them. They were climbing up the dressers, hanging onto the beams, swinging on the fishing nets, hanging across them, playing pranks on the clock, on the table and the mantelpiece, sliding down the saucepan handles, riding races on mice. They were everywhere, in fact, and up to every kind of game. They were all very beautifully dressed. Most of the little men wore green velvet trimmed with scarlet, and their long green caps, which most of them were waving frantically, had long scarlet feathers in them. They all wore little red boots too, and large silver spurs, at least large for fairies. The ladies were very consequential little people indeed, and swept about in their long trained gowns as though they were court ladies at a drawing-room. On their little shoes they had diamond buckles, and their great steeple-crowned hats were garlanded with beautiful flowers, such flowers as are seldom seen on Christmas Eve, but the little people have gardens under the sea where the flowers bloom in wonderful beauty all the year round. Fishermen see them sometimes on moonlight nights, when the water is clear and the wind calm, and if they listen closely, they can hear exquisite fairy music floating across the waters from bay to bay. Back in the corner by Betty's wood heap were a lot of Spriggans, poor, depressed little creatures, dirty and sullen-looking. They were not lively like the others, for you know they have to guard the fairy treasures all the year round, and they get no fun at all, as other fairies do, so they are naturally not very lively. While Joan was standing gazing open-mouthed, bewildered by what she saw, strains of the most beautiful music reached her ears, and gradually a change began to come over the whole house. It was no wonder that she thought her head was turned. The music came nearer, and mingling with it was the tramp of hundreds of little feet. At last it came quite close, and through the window marched a regiment of robins as unconcernedly as a regiment of soldiers entering their barracks. Quite gravely they stepped down from the window, marched across the room, and flew up to the beam, where they perched themselves in perfect order and began to sing as hard as they possibly could. In a moment or two they were followed through the window by a regiment of wrens, and then by a regiment of little people, all playing on every kind of musical instrument ever invented, and on a number made out of reeds and shells such as had never been seen before or since. Stepping down gracefully from the window to the floor, the band, followed by numbers of little ladies and gentlemen, carrying branches of herbs and flowers, marched with stately tread past old Betty Trenance, bowed to her in a most respectful manner in passing, then arranged themselves in perfect order behind her. Last of all came another troop of fairies, and these took the herbs and flowers brought by the little ladies and gentlemen and placed them in Betty's apron. "These are what she makes her salves and ointments of," thought Joan to herself. "No wonder she's thought so clever." This done, all the other fairies who had been playing about the house came down to the floor and joined the newcomers. Such a crowd never was seen. No sooner had the flowers and herbs been heaped in Betty's lap than another troop of fairies came forward with foxglove bells full of dyes, which they poured over Betty's dress, when in a moment her russet gown was changed to the softest white velvet, her apron to the filmiest lace, edged all round with a delicate fringe of harebells and snowdrops. Other fairies outlined the quilted diamonds of her petticoat with silver cord. When her dress had been transformed in this way, all the troop of little people came forward with dainty bunches of flowers to complete her toilette. Sweet wild flowers they were, delicate speedwells and forget-me-nots with their fresh green, and their innocent blue eyes, the warm scarlet pimpernel, violets, snowdrops, heather bells, and ladies' white petticoats, some of each and every kind of flower we find in the lanes and hedges. The little ladies stitched a small nosegay in each diamond of Betty's petticoat, and every nosegay was different. The tiniest flowers of all they laid on sprays of feathery moss. Others had background of graceful ferns or delicate grass. Around the hem of the skirt were sprays of pink and white dog roses, while the bodice was wreathed with tiny pink and white convolvulus. Sparkling at Betty's throat were such brilliant jewels that Joan had to look away. Her eyes were so dazzled. The strangest part of all this was that Betty did not seem in the least surprised at what was going on, and was apparently quite unaware that Joan was watching her. As soon as the gown was completed, another group of the clever little creatures clambered up to the top of the high-backed chair in which Betty was seated, and began to arrange her hair. Some had quaint little pots in their hands from which they poured delicate perfumes over Betty's head. Joan picked up one of the pots, which they threw aside when empty, and found to her astonishment that it was only a poppy head. Then they carefully arranged every curl and wave of Betty's hair until she looked as beautiful as a queen, and as dignified and stately too. For Betty, though a mischievous witch, was not at all like our ideas of one. She was as clean as a new pin, and as neat and tidy as anyone could be. Her features were unusually handsome, and her thick dark hair, which reached the ground when she sat down, was full of the prettiest curls and waves. As soon as the last curl was arranged, and her tire-maidens satisfied, they placed a spray of jessamine amongst her tresses and jumped down, their task completed. All this time the music was playing the most bewitching melodies. Very soon after this, Joan began to have a feeling that Betty wished her gone. The little people, too, were making signs that she could not fail to understand, and such hideous grimaces at her, too, that made her long to box their ears. Of course, neither Betty nor the fairies knew that she had used the fairy ointment, and could see them, and to save herself from being found out, she bade her friend good-bye with all speed. When Joan got outside, though, she could not resist one more sly peep in, just to make sure she had not been dreaming. So down went her eye to the finger-hole again. But all she saw was the kitchen with its sanded floor and bright turf fire, the key beam with the nets hanging across it, and Betty stitching away as fast as her fingers could fly. "This is the most extraordinary thing I ever heard tell of," said Joan to herself. "I'll have another look." Down went her eye again, but the right one this time, and lo and behold, there was the kitchen turned into a splendid banqueting hall, hung round with tapestry representing everything that had ever happened in the world. The tall fat rail was turned into a balcony hung with pale blue satin, where sat a number of little ladies and gentlemen watching the dancing which was going on below. The costumes of all were magnificent. The cottage was as beautiful as a bit of fairyland, and seated on a golden chair of state, under a velvet canopy, was Betty Trenance, looking as royal as a queen. Betty, though, seemed to be keeping a sharp eye on the door, and as she had a crowd of wicked little piskies about her, Joan thought it wise to get away to safer quarters. So off she hurried, but as she went, she met numbers of fairies all hurrying away to Betty's cottage, while from the rocks below came the doleful wail of the mermaids, and all was so uncanny, Joan was glad to hurry along as fast as she knew how. She was really scared by this time, and the light was growing dim, for it was already past 3 o'clock. Once arrived at Penzance, Joan did her marketing quickly, but by the time she had finished she was very tired and very hungry, for she had had nothing to eat since 12 o'clock dinner, and had been trudging about for hours. So having a piece of saffron cake in her basket, she turned into an inn in Market Jew Street, to get something to drink with it, and a place to sit down for a while to rest. When she got there, she found the house so crowded that she had to sit on a bench outside, and here she met a lot of friends and had a thorough good gossip. They drank each other's health too, and passed the compliments of the season until Joan remembered all of a sudden that she ought to have been on her way home by that time, for the squire would be very angry if she were not there to see to things for the supper party. Up she jumped in a great flurry, and had said good-bye all round when she suddenly remembered that she had not yet bought several of the things she had come to town on purpose to get. She was dreadfully vexed, but there was no time to stay and think about it. She had just to hurry back into the market and make her purchases as quickly as possible. At last she had really bought everything and was about to leave, when unfortunately some wonderful bargains caught her eye, and it did seem to her sinful to go away without taking a glance at them, when she might never have such a chance again. So she lingered by the stalls and wandered up and down, having a good look at everything, when whom should she see doing the very same thing but Tom Trunance? He did not see Joan, so she thought she would go up and speak to him, and ask if he was going home soon, for it would be nice to have his company on the way. He was so busy, though, darting about from stall to stall, that Joan could never get up to him, but she could see what he was doing, and the sight made Joan's blood boil with indignation. He was helping himself to everything that took his fancy: yarn, stockings, boots, spoons, clothing, until the wonder was that he could manage to stow the things away. The oddest part of all, though, was that nobody seemed to see him. Joan looked again and again to make sure she was not dreaming, but no, he was there right enough, and pocketing things as fast as he could, right under the stall-keepers' very noses, and they paying no heed whatsoever to him. Joan could bear it no longer. She could not stand by and see such wickedness going on. It made her blood boil with indignation. So over she bustled and touched him on the arm. "Tom Trunance," she cried, "I'm downright ashamed of ye. I wonder you ain't above carrying on such dishonest ways, and you with children to set an example to. I didn't think you capable of such wickedness." Tom, for a minute, looked, and was too much taken aback to speak, but he quickly recovered himself. "Why, Joan," he said, taking no notice of her accusations, "I take it very kind and neighbourly o' ye to come up and speak. What sharp eyes you've got. Now, which of them did you happen to catch sight of me with?" "Which? Why, both, of course," cried Joan, but she put up her hand first over one and then over the other, and found she could only see Tom with the right one. "Why, no, I can't see ye with both," she cried in astonishment. "The left one doesn't seem to be a bit of good." "The right one, is it?" said Tom, and his look went through her like a gimlet. Then, pointing his finger at it, he muttered, "Thou wicked old spy, thou shalt no more see me, nor peep nor pry with that charmed eye." And at that very moment a sharp pain shot through her right eye. It was so sharp that she screamed aloud, and from that moment she never could see with it again. Yelling and pressing her fist into her throbbing eyeball, she rushed hither and thither, calling to people to come and help her, and to go and fetch Tom Trunance, all in one breath. But as they could not see Tom, nor could she either now, they unkindly said the poor soul was crazy, which of course was most unjust and cruel of them, and shows what mistakes people can make. Of course it was the fairy ointment on her eye which enabled her to see so much, and it was that same ointment which rendered Tom Trunance invisible to everyone but to her. How poor Joan ever found her way back to Market Jew Street again she never could tell. But when she did arrive there, she had, of course, to stay a little while and tell her sad story, so that it was really quite late and dark before she started for home. And then, what with the darkness and her blindness, she could only crawl along. She groped her way painfully down Vandervoer and over the green, stumbling over the ruts and sandy banks until she was very nearly driven crazy. Through only being able to see with her left eye, she kept bearing away to the left side of the road, and I cannot tell you how many times she fell into the ditch, marketing and all, and so afraid was she of falling into the sea, and so close did she keep to the other side of the road away from it, that at last she went right through the hedge and fell over into a place called Park and Shibar. Luckily, one of the farm boys was in the field and helped her up and picked up her parcels for her. Then, seeing how bad she was, he took her into the house to rest and recover, for she seemed quite dazed by that time. There they gave her something to bring her round, and presently she began to feel better and able to go on again. By this time she was very anxious to go home, so the lad helped her over the stream and set her on the right road once more. This time Joan stepped out briskly, for she was really very troubled about the squire's supper, and all the people who were expected to it. If she did not get home soon, they would have arrived first, and oh, how angry the squire would be. By the time, though, that she got to the top of Paul Hill, she was so tired she felt she could not go another step without a rest. So, though she could badly spare the time, she dropped with a sigh of relief onto a soft green spot, when, oh, what a shriek she gave! For the soft green spot was a duck pond covered with duckweed. How she got out of the pond she could never tell, but she did, and crept over to the other side of the road, where she fell back on the hedge quite exhausted. "Oh dear, she moaned. "I'm nearly dead. Oh, if only I got our old dumpling here to give me a lift. Or any other quiet old horse I'd be thankful for. I shall never reach home tonight on my 2 feet, I'm sure. They're ready to drop off already." Barely had she uttered her wish, when there by the roadside stood an old white horse, cropping quietly away at the brambles and dead ferns. How he came there I can't tell you. Whether he had been there all the time without her seeing him, or whether he came by magic, no one can say, but there he was. Many persons in Dame Joan's place would have been afraid to mount him, fearing witchcraft or fairies' pranks, but Joan was too tired to have many scruples, so up she got and untied his feet, for he was hobbled, put the rope round his head, and then managed somehow to clamber up on his back, basket and all. It was hard work, but she got settled after a bit, then picking up the rope, called to him to start. "Geewog, geewo," she called. "Get up, you lazy old faggot." And she hammered away at his side with her heels with all her might, and her shoes were none of the daintiest, but in spite of her coaxings and her threats, her kicks and her thumps, the old horse did not move an inch. "Come up, can you? Geewog, come here." She beat him and kicked him again until she was really too tired to move hand or foot. Then, when she had given up in despair, the tiresome creature made a start. But such a start! He went at a slow snail's pace, and try as Joan would, she could not make him go faster. At last, though, when she reached the top of a hill, there came from the valley below the cry of hounds. Devil's hounds they must have been, for no others would be out at that time of night. As soon as the sounds reached the old horse's ears, he pricked them up, whinnied loudly, and with a toss of his head and a fling of his tail, started away like any young colt. Away, away, uphill and downhill they tore as fast as the wind. Joan clung to the horse's mane with both hands and yelled to him to stop. She might as well, though, have held her breath. All her marketing flew out of her basket, her precious beaver hat was carried away, her shawl was whisked off her back. On and on the old horse tore, jumping over everything that came in his way, until Joan was nearly flung from his back. Presently, too, to her horror, she saw that the creature was growing bigger and bigger, and higher and higher. Soon he shot up above the trees. Then he was as high as the church tower. Poor Joan, perched on his back, grew sick and giddy and terrified. She was afraid now to slip off, lest she should be dashed to pieces, and was afraid to stay there lest she should fall off. For miles and miles they travelled like this, until at last they came to Tolldave Moor, on the further side of which there was, Joan knew, a deep black pool, and for this pool, to Joan's horror, the monster galloped straight. "If I don't slip off now, I shall surely be drowned outright," thought poor Joan, for the pond was deep. She felt her powers were failing her, her hands were numb, her limbs cramped. She knew she could not swim. "Better a dry death than a wet one. It will save my clothes anyway." So letting her hold of the creature's mane, she was about to let herself slide down, when the wind caught her and carried her right off the horse's back. They were going at a terrific rate, and the wind was very keen on the moor. It lifted her right up in the air, high above the horse, and then, just as she thought she was going to disappear through the clouds, she was dropped plump into the rushes by the edge of the very pool itself. At the same moment, the air became filled with the most awful clamour, such yells and cries and terrible laughter as no living being had ever heard before. Poor old Joan thought her last hour had really come, and gave herself up for lost. For when she looked round, she saw the fearful great creature she had been riding disappearing in the distance in flames of fire, and tearing after it, helter-skelter, pell-mell, was a horrible crew of men and dogs and horses. 200 or 300 of them there must have been, and not one of the lot had a head on his shoulders. Joan would have screamed too, if she had not been stricken dumb with fright, so very nearly scared to death, trembling with cold and fear. There she lay, until they had disappeared. How she scrambled out of her soft, damp resting place she could never tell, but she did, somehow, and got as far as Trove Bottom, though without any shoes, for they had come off in the ditch. Her shawl was gone too, and all her marketing, and worst of all, her precious broad-brimmed beaver hat. There was a linhay down at the bottom, where Squire Lovell kept a lot of sheep, and into that Joan crept and lay down, and from sheer exhaustion fell asleep and slept till morning. How much longer she would have slept, no one knows. But on Sunday mornings it was the squire's habit to go down and look over his sheep, and on this Sunday, though it was Christmas Day, he visited them as usual. His entrance, with his boys and his dogs and his flashing lantern, woke old Joan with a start, and so certain was she that they were the horse and the huntsman and their hounds come again, that she sprang up in a frenzy of terror. "Get out! Get out!" she cried. "Let a poor old woman be!" But instead of the hollow laugh of the huntsman, it was the squire's voice that answered her. "Why, here's our poor old lost Joan," he cried, amazed, and frightened out of her wits, seemingly. "Why, Joan," he said, "whatever have you been spending the night out here for? We've been scouring the country for you for hours." "Oh, master," she cried, almost in tears as she dropped trembling at his feet, "for the sake of all the years I've served ye, from your cradle up, do ye let me die in peace and bury me decent." And then, her tongue once set going, she poured out all the long tale of the dreadful things that had happened to her since she set out for Penzance Market. How long she would have talked no one knows, but the squire sent for his men, and between them they carried her home, and warmed and fed and comforted her, for she was black and blue, wet to the skin and half frozen. However, with all their care she soon recovered, and when she was dry and warm and rested, she poured out all her adventures and disasters. To her astonishment, though, and anger and pain, they refused to believe a word of it. They did not pity her a bit. They even laughed at her. Indeed, they tried to make her believe that the enchanted steed was only the miller's old white horse, that the demon huntsman and his hounds were no more nor less than her own son riding across the moor with the dogs in search of her, that her lost eye must have been scratched out by a fuzz bush. And so they went on pooh-poohing the whole of her story. which was very nearly the most aggravating thing of all she had had to bear. One thing, though, Joan had not told them, and that was about her stealing the fairy ointment, or they would have known that she had been pisky-led that night, by order of the fairies as a punishment, and would one and all have agreed that she richly deserved it. The Exciting Adventure of John Sturtridge. One of the greatest feast days in Cornwall, and the most looked forward to, is St. Picron's Day, which falls just before Christmas. It is the special day of the tinners and streamers, their greatest holiday in the year, and on it they have a great merrymaking. Picron's was the discoverer of tin in Cornwall, so they say. So of course it is the bounden duty of those who earn their living by it to keep up his day with rejoicings. It is not of St. Picron's, though, that I am going to tell you, but of John Sturtridge, a streamer, and what befell him one year when he had been keeping up St. Picron's Day. He had been up to the rising sun, to the great supper that was always held there, and to the merrymaking after it, and had enjoyed himself mightily. Enjoyed himself so much, in fact, that he did not greatly relish having to turn out when both were ended and face a long walk home. It was a bitterly cold night, and the road was a lonely one, all across Tregarden Downs. However, it had to be faced, and nothing was gained by putting it off. So John started, and at first he got along pretty well. True, he found the roads very puzzling and difficult to follow, but that may have been the fault of the moonlight or the will-o'-the-wisps. Anyhow, if he did not get on very rapidly, he got on somehow and presently reached the downs. Now, Tregarden Downs is a horribly wild, uncanny stretch of country, a place where no one chooses to walk alone after nightfall. And though John was in a cheerful mood and did not feel at all frightened, he quickened his steps and pulled hot-foot for home and bed. He kept a sharp eye on the cart tracks too, for he had no fancy for going astray here, as he had done in the lanes. Whether, though, he did go a little astray or not, no one can say, but all of a sudden, what should be coming up right across his path but a host of piskies, playing all sorts of games and high jinks under the shelter of a great granite boulder. Whatever John's feelings may have been at the sight of them, the piskies were not troubled by the sight of John. They were not in the least alarmed, the daring little imps. They only burst into roars of wicked laughter, which pretty nearly scared the wits out of poor John, and made him take to his heels and run for his life. If only he could get off the downs, he thought, he would be safe enough. But the downs, of which he knew every yard, seemed tonight to stretch for miles and miles, and, try as he would, he could not find his way off them. He wandered round and up and down and to and fro, until at last he was obliged to admit to himself that he did not know in the least where he was, for he could not find a single landmark to guide him. It is a very unpleasant thing to lose yourself on a big lonely down, on a bleak winter's night, but it is 10 times more unpleasant when you are pursued all the way by scores of mischievous little sprites, who shriek with laughter at you all the time, and from sheer wickedness delight in leading you into all the marshy places, the prickly fuzz bushes and rough boulders they can find, and nearly die of laughter when you prick or bump yourself or get stuck in the mud. John was thoroughly frightened, and thoroughly out of temper, and was meditating how he could punish his little tormentors, when suddenly from all sides rose a shrill cry, "Ho and away for Par Beach! Ho and away for Par Beach! Ho and away for Par Beach!" Hardly knowing what he was doing, John shouted too, "Ho and away for Par Beach!" He yelled at the top of his voice, and almost before he had said the words he was caught high up in the air, and in another minute found himself on the great stretch of sands at Par. As soon as they had recovered their breath, the piskies all formed up in rings and began to dance as fast as their little feet could move, and John with them. "Ho and away for Squire Tremain's cellar!" The shrill cry rang out again, even as they danced. John again repeated the cry, and in a flash found himself in the cellars at Helligan, Squire Tremain's place, with his mischievous little companions swarming all over them. John felt no fear of them now. He joined them in all their pranks and had a good time running from cask to cask and bottle to bottle, opening everything and tasting the contents of most. John at last became so confused he could not remember who he was or where he was. In fact, he was so confused and so sleepy that when the piskies called out, "Ho and away for Par Beach!" try as he would, he could not speak. So the piskies flew off and John was left behind alone. John did not mind it in the least at first, for it was much more pleasant in the shelter of the cellar with plenty of wine to warm him than it would be out in the desolate sands at Par, where the wind blows keenly enough to take one's ears off. John did mind, though, the next morning when the butler came and discovered him. He was groping his way between 2 rows of casks, trying to find his way to Luxullian. He explained to the butler, but the butler, instead of putting him in the right road, led him at once to Squire Tremain's study, where John told the wonderful story of his adventures. Strangely enough, though, neither the squire nor anyone else would believe a word of them, and without any consideration for poor John's feelings, they popped him into Bodmin jail almost as quickly as the piskies and he had popped into the cellar, and worse still, before much time had elapsed, they tried him, convicted him, and sentenced him to be hanged. Poor John! Here was a dreadful state of affairs, and all brought on an innocent man by those wicked piskies. There was no escape either, or hope of reprieve, for people were not so tender-hearted in those days as in these, and a man was not only sentenced to death for a trifle, but no one ever took any trouble to get him off. Well, the fatal day came, and John was brought to the gallows, where a large crowd was gathered to see the execution. And there stood John, with the clergyman imploring him to confess and free his mind of a load of falsehood, and the hangman waiting with the noose in his hand, waiting to slip it over poor John's head, when suddenly a beautiful little lady, dressed in white and silver, appeared in the midst of the crowd, gathered at the gallows foot. No one saw her come, no one knew how she got there, but without a word from her, not knowing, indeed, why they did so, every man, woman, and child stood back and left a clear pathway for her right up to the scaffold. There she paused and stood, with eyes fixed on the prisoner, who, however, did not see her, for he was too frightened to notice anything that was going on around him, until, "Ho and away for France!" rang out a sweet voice which John recognized in a moment. With the sound of it, his poor dazed senses returned, and the spirit to seize the chance of escape offered him. "Ho and away for France!" he yelled. There was no danger of his not being able to shout this time, and then, before anyone there could collect their senses, the officers of justice saw their prisoner whisked away from out of their very grasp, and John was in France long before the executioner and the chaplain, the jailers and the crowd had ceased gaping stupidly at each other. The True Story of Anne and the Fairies. More than 200 years ago, there lived in the parish of St. Thief a poor labouring man called Jeffreys, and this man had one daughter called Anne. Anne was a sweetly pretty girl, and a very intelligent one too, but she was a terrible hoyden. She shocked all the old ladies in the village and all the prim people dreadfully, and instead of being ashamed, she seemed to glory in it. Everyone wondered how she came to have such a spirit, and whom she took after, for her mother was as quiet and meek a little woman as ever was born, and always had been, while her father was a stern, silent man, who looked upon his flighty daughter as a thorn in his side, a cross laid upon him for his good. But the fact remains that Anne was the most daring of all the young people in the parish, doing things that even the boys were afraid to do, for she had no fear. Nothing awed her, and there was nothing she would not attempt. In those days the fairies and piskies, witches and goblins of all sorts were all over the land, and everyone knew it, and was more or less in awe of them. The young people appealed to the fairies for everything, to be helped in their work, to get love draughts, to be made beautiful, and to know their fortunes. At the same time, they all, except Anne, would have been scared to death if they had caught sight of one. Anne, indeed, often boldly declared that she longed to see them, and would love to have a talk with them, and she made up her mind that she would too. And when once Anne had got an idea into her head, she generally managed to carry it out. So, without saying anything to anyone, she went out every evening as soon as the sun was gone down, and wandered about, looking into the foxglove bells and under the ferns, examining the fairy rings and every other likely spot, singing, "Fairy fair and fairy bright, come and be my chosen sprite." For though she had got a very good and true sweetheart named Tom, she had a great fancy for a fairy one. Perhaps she was thinking of the lovely presents that people said the fairies gave, or perhaps she thought that she would like to live in a palace, and be dressed in silks and velvet, none of which things could poor Tom give her, of course. On moonlight nights, Anne crept away by herself to the banks of the stream, which ran through the valley, and here, walking against the current, she would sing, "Moon shines bright, water runs clear, I'm here, but where's my fairy dear?" She sang it wistfully enough to touch the heart of any fairy, but though she went on for a long time repeating all the charms she knew, and trying, by every means she could think of, to please the little people, and though she often nearly put her hand on one during her searches, the little people never showed themselves to her. They noticed her, though, and were only biding their time. One beautiful warm summer's day, Anne, having finished her housework early, took her knitting and went and sat in an arbour at the foot of the gardens, for she never could bear to be cooped up indoors if she could possibly get out. She had not been sitting there very long when she heard a rustling amongst the bushes, but she took no notice of it, for she felt it was sure to be her lover coming to have a talk with her. And now that she was so possessed with the thought of a fairy lover, she had ceased to care for poor Tom, and was extremely cool and off-hand with him. So, at the sound of the rustling, even when it was repeated, she did not even raise her eyes from her knitting or turn her head. Presently, though, the bushes were rustled more violently, and then someone gave a little laugh. Anne moved this time, for the laugh was certainly not Tom's laugh. A lane ran along at the back of the arbour, a lane which one had to pass down to get to the garden gate, and it was from here that the laugh came. Anne peeped carefully out through the trellis work and bushes to try to see who it was who was laughing at her, but not a sign of any living being could she see. She felt annoyed, for it is extremely unpleasant to feel that someone is looking at you through a peephole and making game of you. Anne grew so vexed she could not keep her vexation to herself. "Well," she said aloud, feeling sure it was Tom who was trying to tease her, "you may stay there till the moss grows over you, before ever I'll come out to you." A burst of laughter peculiarly sweet and ringing greeted her words. "Oh," she thought to herself, "whoever can it be? I'm certain sure Tom could never laugh like that. Who can it be, I wonder?" She felt really nervous now, for there was something unnatural about it all, but she tried to reassure herself by thinking that nothing could happen to her in broad daylight, such as it was then, besides which she did not know of anyone who wished to harm her, for she was a favourite with everyone in the village. She waited anxiously, though, to see what would happen next. She went on with her knitting, seemingly paying no heed to anything, but her ears were strained to catch the least sound, and when, after a little while, the garden gate was softly opened and closed again, she heard it distinctly, and glancing up to see who was coming, she saw, to her astonishment, not Tom, or anyone else she knew, but 6 little pisky gentlemen, handsome little creatures with pleasant smiles and brilliantly shining eyes. To her astonishment, they did not seem at all disturbed at seeing her, but came up and ranged themselves in a row before her and bowed to the ground. They were all dressed alike in green knickerbockers and tunics edged with scarlet and tiny green caps, and one, the handsomest of the lot, had a beautiful red waving feather at one side of his. They stood and looked at Anne and smiled, and Anne, not at all frightened now, but pleased, smiled back at them. Then he with the red feather stepped in front of the others and, bowing to her in the most courtly manner, addressed her with a charming friendliness which set her at ease at once. Whether this strange little gentleman was really attracted by her charms, or whether he acted in the same way to every pretty girl he met, one cannot say, but he certainly looked at Anne very affectionately and admiringly, and poor Anne's heart was captured at once. She was certain there never had been such a charming little gentleman before, nor ever could be again, nor one with such good taste. Stooping down, she held out her hand, whereupon the little gentleman stepped into it, and Anne lifted him to her lap. From her lap he soon climbed to her shoulder, and then he kissed her, and not only kissed her once, but many times, and Anne thought him more charming than ever. Presently he called his companions, and they climbed up and kissed Anne too, and patted her rosy cheeks, and smoothed her hair, but while one of them was patting her cheek, he ran his finger across her eyes, and Anne gave a terrible scream, for with his touch she felt as though a needle had been run through her eyeballs, and when she tried to open them again, she found she was blind. At the same moment, she felt herself caught up in the air, and for what seemed to her a very long time, she was carried through it at a tremendous rate. At last they came to a stop, whereupon one of the little men said something which Anne could not understand, and behold, her eyesight at once came back. And now, indeed, she had something to use it on, for she found herself in what seemed to be a perfectly gorgeous palace, or rather 2 or 3 palaces joined together, all built of gold and silver, with arches and pillars of crystal, large halls with walls of burnished copper, and beautiful rooms inlaid with precious marbles. Outside was a perfect paradise of a garden, filled with lovely flowers and trees laden with fruit or blossom. Birds were singing everywhere, such rare birds too. Some were all blue and gold, others a bright scarlet, then again others shone like silver or steel. There were large lakes full of gold and silver fish, and marble fountains throwing jets of water high into the air. Here and there were dainty bowers covered with roses, and filled within with soft moss carpets and luxurious couches. Walking about everywhere in this lovely place were scores of little ladies and gentlemen dressed in rich silks and velvets, and with precious stones sparkling and flashing from their fingers, their hair, their shoes. Indeed, they seemed to sparkle all over, like flowers covered with dewdrops. Some strolled along the walks, others reclined in the bowers, and some floated in little scarlet or ivory boats on the lakes. Others sat under the blossoming trees. There seemed indeed no end to them. And to Anne's great astonishment, neither they nor her 6 companions seemed small now. Also, to her great delight, she was dressed as beautifully as any of them, and wore as beautiful jewels. Though she did not know it, she had shrunk to their size, and a very lovely little fairy she made. Her gown was of white silk, with a long train bordered all round with trails of green ivy, and over her shoulders she wore a long green silk cloak, with a little scarlet hood. Her hair looked as though it had been dressed by a court hairdresser, and amidst the puffs and curls sparkled emeralds and diamonds like trembling stars. Her little green slippers had silver heels and diamond buckles on the toes. Round her waist hung a diamond girdle, on her neck too, and fingers. Gems sparkled and flashed with every movement. Oh, how proud and delighted Anne did feel, and how eagerly she hoped that she might always live like this. Instead of having 1 cavalier, as most of the ladies had, she had 6. But the one with the red feather was her favourite. And hour by hour he and Anne grew more deeply in love with one another. Unfortunately, though, the other 5 began to grow very jealous, and they kept such a watch on Anne and her friend that the poor lovers had no chance to get away and talk by themselves, or exchange even a look, or a kiss, or a hand clasp. However, when people are determined, they usually succeed in the end, and one day Anne and her handsome lover managed to slip away unobserved. Hand in hand they ran to a garden which lay at some little distance from the others, one that was seldom used too, and where the flowers grew so tall and in such profusion that they soon were completely hidden amongst them. Here they made their home, and here they lived for a time as happily as any 2 people could who loved each other more than all the world beside. Alas, though, their happiness was too great to last. They had not been in their beautiful retreat very long when one day they heard a great noise and disturbance, and to Anne's dismay, the 5 little men, followed by a crowd of fairies equally angered, burst in on them. They had traced the lovers to the garden, and even to the lily bough in which they had made their home. With drawn swords and faces full of anger, they surrounded the lily and commanded the lovers to come down. Nearly mad with jealousy as they were, they heaped the most cruel and insulting speeches on the poor little pair. Furious with indignation, Anne's lover sprang down, sword in hand, and faced his attackers. But what could one do against such odds? His sword was knocked out of his hand. He himself was overpowered by the numbers who hurled themselves on him. And for a while he fought desperately, his back to the wall, his courage unfailing, but the blows fell on him so fast and furious that in a few minutes he lay bleeding and lifeless at poor Anne's feet. What happened next, Anne never knew. She remembered looking down on her dead lover through eyes almost blind with tears. She remembered seeing his blood staining her dainty green slippers and splashing her gown. Then someone passed a hand over her eyes and she could see nothing. She was as blind as she had been once before. All about her she heard strange noises like the whirring and buzzing of numberless insects. She felt herself being carried through the air at a terrific rate until her breath was quite taken away. Then she was placed on a seat, and in a moment her sight came back to her. She was back in the arbour, where she had first seen the fairies. But instead of 6 little men, she now saw about 26 big men and women, all staring at her with frightened eyes and open mouths. "She's very bad," they were whispering. "Poor maid, she do look ill. 'Tis a fit she's had, and no mistake." Then seeing her open her eyes and look about her, they crowded nearer. "Why, Anne, child, you've been in a fit, haven't ye?" Anne lifted her arm and looked at it, and her hand. There was not a single jewel on either. She glanced down over her gown. It was of linsey-woolsey, not silk or velvet. She closed her eyes again, that they might not see the tears that sprang to them. "I don't know if I've been in a fit," she said wearily, but to herself she added sadly, "I know, though, that I've been in love." Barker and the BUCCAS. Perhaps some of you have never heard about the BUCCAS, or knockers, as some people call them, the busy little people about the same size as piskies, who are said to be the souls of the Jews who used to work in the tin mines in Cornwall. The BUCCAS live always in rocks, mines or wells, and they work incessantly, pickaxing, digging, sifting, etc., from one year's end to the other, except on Christmas Day, Easter Day, All Saints' Day, and the Jew Sabbath. On those days their little tools are laid aside, and all is quiet, but on every other you can, if you listen, hear them hammer, hammer, dig, dig, and their tongues chattering all the time. A lot of these little people lived and worked within the sides of a well in one particular part of Cornwall, the name of which I will not tell you, for in the first place you would not be able to pronounce it if I did, and in the second, you might be tempted to go there and disturb them, which would make them angry and bring all kinds of ill luck and trouble upon yourself. The story I am going to tell you is of someone who did disturb them, and pried upon them after laughing at them. The name of the youth was Barker, a great idle hulking fellow who lived in the neighbourhood of the well where these little BUCCAS dwelt. Now this Barker often heard the neighbours talking about the BUCCAS and praising their industry, and like most idle people he disliked hearing others praised for doing what he knew he ought to do but would not. So, to annoy the neighbours and the BUCCAS too, he declared he didn't believe there wasn't no such things. Seeing was believing, and when they showed him a BUCCA, 'twould be soon enough for him to believe there was such things. And he repeated this every time the little men were mentioned. "'Tis nowt but dreams," he sneered. "There bain't no BUCCAs in Fairywell, no more nor I'm a BUCCA." "You a BUCCA?" cried the neighbours. "Why, they wouldn't own such a lazy good-for-nothing. They does more work in a morning than you'd get through in a year. You who never does a hand's turn for anybody and haven't sense enough to earn your own bread." "I've sense enough to find out if there's any such things as BUCCAs in there well, and I'll go there and watch and listen till I finds out something. And if there's BUCCAs there, I'll catch one." So away he went to spend his time idly lying amidst the tall grass and ferns which grew thickly around the well. This sort of job suited him to a nicety, for the sun was warm and pleasant, and he did not work. For, said he, if he was to work he wouldn't be able to hear any sounds that might come from below. And for once he spoke the truth. Day after day Barker went and lay by the fairy well, and at first he heard never a sound but the birds singing and the bees humming, and his own breathing. By and by, though, other sounds began to make themselves heard by him. Noises of digging and hammering, and numbers of little voices talking and laughing merrily. Barker could not at first make out what they said, but he could understand that they were always busy. Instead, though, of taking them as an example, the lazy fellow only said to himself gleefully that if others worked so hard, there was the less need for him to do so. Having discovered that his neighbours were right, and that there really were such people as BUCCAs, you would have thought that he would have hurried home to tell his discoveries. But no, he liked the lazy life, lying in the sun by the well doing nothing. So he kept quiet about his discovery, and every day started off for his favourite spot, making the excuse that he was still watching for BUCCAs. As the days passed by, he began to understand what the little workmen said, and he gathered from their talk that they worked in sets, and that each set worked for 8 hours, which was, of course, the origin of the 8 hours day we hear so much about. He also found that when they had finished, they hid away their tools, and every day in a fresh place. I cannot tell you why they hid them, or from whom, unless it was those other little people, the fairies and piskies, who love to be up to mischief when they are not doing good. It could not have been from each other that they hid the things, for they talked together about the hiding places. One evening, when the day's work was coming to an end, Barker heard the usual discussion begin. "I shall hide mine in this cleft in the rock," said one. "Very well, then I will hide mine under the ferns." "Oh," said a third, "I shall leave mine on Barker's knee." You may be sure it gave Barker quite a shock to hear his own name spoken in those mysterious regions. It frightened him too, but before he could stir his big lazy body and run away, as he meant to do, he felt 3 hard blows, bang, whack, bang, and then a heavy weight fell crash upon his knee. Barker roared and bellowed like a great calf, for the pain was very great, and he was a big coward. "Take it away! Take it away!" he cried, but the only answer was peal upon peal of mocking laughter. "Oh, my poor knee! Oh, my poor knee! I'm lame for life! Take away them tools! Oh, my! Oh, my!" But the more he screamed, the more the BUCCAS laughed. They laughed and laughed until they were tired. Then they vanished, and Master Barker was left to make his way home as best he could. He did not want to tell the neighbors how he got his stiff knee, but pretended he had had a fall. The neighbors, though, soon found out, and pretty well he was laughed at for a long time wherever he went. Never again did Barker doubt the existence of the BUCCAS. Never again did he speak disrespectfully of them, nor could he forget the lesson he had been taught, for to his dying day he had a stiff knee, and nothing would cure it. Now, if ever you hear of anyone having Barker's knee, you will know that he has spoken rudely of the BUCCAS, and that the BUCCAS have paid him out. LUTEY and the Mermaid. One lovely summer evening, many, many years ago, an old man named LUTEY was standing on the seashore not far from that beautiful bit of coast called the Lizard. On the edge of the cliff above him stood a small farm, and here he lived, spending his time between farming, fishing, and we must admit it, smuggling too, whenever he got a chance. This summer evening he had finished his day's work early, and while waiting for his supper he strolled along the sands a little way to see if there was any wreckage to be seen, for it was long since he had had any luck in that way, and he was very much put out about it. This evening, though, he was no luckier than he had been before, and he was turning away, giving up his search as hopeless, when from somewhere out seaward came a long, low, wailing cry. It was not the melancholy cry of a gull, but of a woman or child in distress. LUTEY stopped and listened and looked back, but, as far as he could see, not a living creature was to be seen on the beach but himself, even though, while he listened, the sound came wailing over the sand again, and this time left no doubt in his mind. It was a voice. Someone was in trouble, evidently, and calling for help. Far out on the sands rose a group of rocks, which, though covered at high water, were bare now. It was about half ebb, and spring tide too, so the sea was further out than usual, and so far, in fact, that a wide bar of sand stretched between the rocks and the sea. It was from these rocks that the cry seemed to come, and LUTEY, feeling sure that someone was out there in distress, turned and walked back quickly to see if he could give any help. As he drew near, he saw that there was no one on the landward side, so he hurried round to the seaward, and there, to his amazement, his eyes met a sight which left him almost speechless. Lying on a ledge at the base of the rock, partially covered by the long seaweed which grew in profusion over its rough sides, and partially by her own hair, which was the most glorious you can possibly imagine, was the most beautiful woman his eyes had ever lighted upon. Her skin was a delicate pink and white, even more beautiful than those exquisite little shells one picks up sometimes on the seashore. Her clear green eyes sparkled and flashed like the waves with the sun on them, while her hair was the colour of rich gold like the sun in its glory, and with a ripple in it, such as one sees on the sea on a calm day. This wonderful creature was gazing mournfully out at the distant sea and uttering from time to time the pitiful cry which had first attracted LUTEY's attention. She was evidently in great distress, but how to offer her help and yet not frighten her he knew not, for the roar of the sea had deadened the sound of his footsteps on the soft sand, and she was quite unconscious of his presence. LUTEY coughed and hemmed, but it was of no use. She could not, or did not hear. He stamped, he kicked the rock, but all in vain, and at last he had to go close to her and speak. "What's the matter, missy?" he said. "What be doing all out here by yourself?" He spoke as gently as possible, but in spite of his gentleness, the lovely creature shrieked with terror and, diving down into the deep pool at the base of the rock, disappeared entirely. At first, LUTEY thought she had drowned herself, but when he looked closely into the pool and contrived to peer through the cloud of hair which floated like seaweed all over at the top of it, he managed to distinguish a woman's head and shoulders underneath. And looking closer, he saw, he was sure, a fish's tail. His knees quaked under him at that sight, for he realized that the lovely lady was no other than a mermaid. She, though, seemed as frightened as he was, so he summoned up his courage to speak to her again, for it is always wise to be kind to mermaids, and to avoid offending them. For if they are angry, there is no knowing what harm they may do to you. "Don't be frightened, lady," he said coaxingly. "I wouldn't hurt ye for the world. I wouldn't harm a living creature. I only wants to know what your trouble is." While he was speaking, the maiden had raised her head slightly above the water, and now was gazing at him with eyes the like of which he had never seen before. "I hope she understands Cornish," he added to himself, "for 'tis the only language I'm fluent in." "Beautiful sir," she replied in answer to his thoughts. "We sea folk can understand all languages, for we visit the coast of every land, and all the tribes of the world sail over our kingdom, and oft-times come down through the waters to our home. The greatest kindness you can do me is to go away. You are accustomed to women who walk, covered with silks and laces. We could not wear such in our world, sporting in the waves, swimming into caverns, clambering into sunken ships. You cannot realize our free and untrammeled existence." "Now, my lovely lady," said old LUTEY, who did not understand a half of what she was saying, "don't ye think anything about such trifles, but stop your tears and tell me what I can do for ye. For sure I can help ye somehow. Tell me how you comed here, and where you wants to get to." So the fair creature floated higher in the water, and gradually growing braver, she presently climbed up and perched herself on the rock where LUTEY had first seen her. Her long hair fell about her like a glorious mantle, and she needed no other, for it quite covered her. Holding in her hand her comb and mirror, and glancing from time to time at the latter, she told the old man her story. "Only a few hours ago," she said sadly, "I was sporting about with my husband and children, as happy as a mermaiden could be. At length, growing weary, we all retired to rest in one of the caverns at Kernow, and there, on a soft couch of seaweed, my husband laid himself down to sleep. The children went off to play, and I was left alone. For some time I watched the crabs playing in the water, or the tiny fish at the bottom of the pools, but the sweet scent of flowers came to me from the gardens of your world, borne on the light breeze, and I felt I must go and see what these flowers were like, whose breath was so beautiful, for we have nothing like it in our dominions. Exquisite sea plants we have, but they have no sweet perfume. Seeing that my husband was asleep and the children quite happy and safe, I swam off to this shore, but when here I found I could not get near the flowers. I could see them on the tops of the cliffs far, far beyond my reach, so I thought I would rest here for a time and dress my hair, while breathing in their sweetness. I sat on dreaming of your world and trying to picture to myself what it was like, until I awoke with a start to find the tide far out beyond the bar. I was so frightened I screamed to my husband to come and help me, but even if he heard me, he could not get to me over the sandy ridge, and if he wakes before I am back and misses me, he will be so angry, for he is very jealous. He will be hungry too, and if he finds no supper prepared, he will eat some of the children."
"Oh, my dear," cried LUTEY, quite horrified. "He surely would never do such a dreadful thing."
"Ah, you do not know mermen," she said sorrowfully. "They are such gluttons, and will gobble up their children in a moment if their meals are a little late. Scores of my children have been taken from me. That is how it is," she explained, "that you do not oftener see us sea folk. Poor children, they never learn wisdom. Directly their father begins to whistle or sing, they crowd about him. They are so fond of music, and he gets them to come and kiss his cheek, or whisper in his ear. Then he opens wide his mouth, and in they go. Oh dear, what shall I do? I have only 10 little ones left, and they will all be gone if I don't get home before he wakes."
"Don't ye take on so, my dear. The tide will soon be in, and then you can float off as quick as you like."
"Oh, but I cannot wait," she cried, tears running down her cheeks. "Beautiful mortal, help me. Carry me out to sea. Give me your aid for 10 minutes only, and I will make you rich and glorious for life. Ask of me anything you want, and it shall be yours." LUTEY was so enthralled by the loveliness of the mermaid that he stood gazing at her, lost in wonder. Her voice, which sounded like a gentle murmuring stream, was to him the most lovely music he had ever heard. He was so fascinated that he would have done anything she asked him. He stooped to pick her up. "First of all, take this," she said, giving him her pearl comb. "Take this to prove to you that you have not been dreaming, gentle stranger, and that I will do for you what I have said. When you want me, comb the sea 3 times with this, and call me by my name, Morwenna, and I will come to you. Now take me to the sea." Stooping again, he picked her up in his arms. She clung tightly to him, twining her long, cool arms around his neck until he felt half suffocated. "Tell me your wishes," she said sweetly as they went along. "You shall have 3. Riches will, of course, be one."
"No, lady," said LUTEY thoughtfully. "I don't know that I'm so set on getting gold, but I'll tell ye what I should like. I'd dearly love to be able to remove the spells of the witches, to have power over the spirits, to make them tell me all I want to know, and I'd like to be able to cure diseases." "You are the first unselfish man I have met," cried the mermaid admiringly. "You shall have your wishes, and in addition I promise you as a reward that your family shall never come to want." In a state of great delight, LUTEY trudged on with his lovely burthen, while she chatted gaily to him of her home, of the marvels and the riches of the sea, and the world that lay beneath it. "Come with me, noble youth," she cried. "Come with me to our caves and palaces. There are riches, beauty, and everything mortal can want.
Our homes are magnificent. The roofs are covered with diamonds and other gems, so that it is ever light and sparkling. The walls are of amber and coral. Your floors are of rough, ugly rocks. Ours are of mother of pearl. For statuary, we have the bodies of Earth's most beautiful sons and daughters, who come to us in ships sent by the King of the Storms. We embalm them so that they look more lovely even than in life, with their eyes still sparkling, their lips of ruby red, and the delicate pink of the seashell in their cheeks. Come and see for yourself how well we care for them, and how reposeful they look in their pearl and coral homes, with sea plants growing around them and gold and silver heaped at their feet. They crossed the world to get it, and their journeys have not been failures. Will you come, noble stranger? Come to be one of us, whose lives are all love and sunshine and merriment.
None of it's in my line, I'm thinking, my dear, said LUTEY. I'd rather come across some of the things that have gone down in the wrecks. Wines and brandy, laces and silks. There's a pretty sight if it all gone to the bottom. One time and another, I'm thinking.
Ah, yes, we have vast cellars full of the choicest wines ever made, and caves stored with laces and silks. Come, stranger, come, and take all you want.
Well, answered the old smuggler, who was thinking what a fine trade he could do if only he could reach those caves and cellars. I must say I'd like to. 'Tis very tempting, but I should never live to get there, I'm thinking. I should be drowned or smothered before I'd got halfway.
No, oh no, I can manage that for you. I will make 2 slits under your chin. Your lovely countenance will not suffer, for your beard will hide them. Such a pair of gills is all you want, so do not fear. Do not leave me, generous-hearted youth. Come to the mermaid's home. They were in the sea by this time, and the breakers they wanted to reach were not far off. LUTEY felt strangely tempted to go with this siren. Her flashing green eyes had utterly bewitched him by this time, and her promises had turned his head. She saw that he was almost consenting, almost in her power. She clasped her long, wet, finny fingers more closely round his neck and pressed her cool lips to his cheeks. Another instant and LUTEY would have gone to his doom, but at that moment there came from the shore the sound of a dog barking as though in distress. It was the barking of LUTEY's own dog, a great favourite with his master. LUTEY turned to look. At the edge of the water the poor creature stood, evidently frantic to follow its master. It dashed into the sea and out again, struggling, panting. Beyond on the cliff stood his home, the windows flaming against the sun, his garden, and the country round looking green and beautiful. The smoke was rising from his chimney. Ah, his supper! The thought of his nice hot meal broke the spell, and he saw his danger.
Let me go! Let me go! He shrieked, trying to lower the mermaid to the ground. She only clung the more tightly to him. He felt a sudden fear and loathing of the creature with the scaly body and fish's tail. Her green eyes no longer fascinated him. He remembered all the tales he had heard of the power of mermaids and their wickedness, and grew more and more terrified. "Let me go!" he yelled again. "Unwind your ghastly great tail from about my legs, and your skinny fingers from off my throat, or I'll kill you!" And with the same he whipped his big clasp knife from his pocket. As the steel flashed before the mermaid's eyes, she slipped from him and swam slowly away. But as she went, she sang, and the words floated back to LUTEY mournfully, yet threateningly. "Farewell, farewell for 9 long years. Then, my love, I will come again. Mine, mine, forever mine." Poor LUTEY, greatly relieved to see her disappear beneath the waves, turned and waded slowly back to land. But so shaken and upset was he by all that had happened, that it was almost more than he could accomplish. On reaching the shore, he just managed to scramble to the shed where he kept many of the treasures he had smuggled from time to time. But having reached it, he dropped down in a deep, overpowering sleep. Poor old Anne Betty Lutey was in a dreadful state of mind when supper time came and went and her husband had not returned. He had never missed it before. All through the night she watched anxiously for him, but when breakfast time came and there still was no sign of him, she could not rest at home another minute, and started right away in search of him. She did not have to search far, though. Outside the door of the shed she found the dog lying sleeping, and as the dog was seldom seen far from his master, she thought she would search the shed first. And there, of course, she found her husband. He was still sound asleep. Anne Betty, vexed at once at having been frightened for nothing, shook him none too gently. "Here, Lutey, get up to once, do you hear?" she cried crossly. "Why ever didn't ye come in to supper? Such a beautiful bit of roast as I'd got too. Where ye been? What have ye been doing? What have ye been sleeping here for?" Lutey raised himself into a sitting position. "Who are you?" he shouted. "Are you the beautiful maiden? Come from me? Are you Morwenna?" "Whatever are you talking about? You haven't called me beautiful for the last 30 years, and I ain't called Morwenna. I'm Anne Betty Lutey, your own lawful wife, and if you don't know me, you must be gone clean out of your mind." "Anne Betty Lutey?" said the old man solemnly. "If you're my lawful wife, you've had a narrow escape this night of being left a widow woman, and you may be thankful you've ever set eyes on me again." "Come in and have some breakfast," said Anne Betty Lutey sternly. "And if you ain't better, then I'll send for the doctor. It's my belief your brain is turned." Lutey got up obediently and went in to his breakfast. Indeed, he was glad enough for it, for he was light-headed from want of food. His breakfast did him good. Before he had finished it, he was able to tell his wife about his adventure the night before, and he told it so gravely and sensibly that Anne Betty believed every word of it, and no longer thought his brain was turned. Indeed, she was so much impressed by his story that before many hours had passed she had gone round to every house in the parish spreading the news. And to prove the truth of it, she produced the pearl comb. Then, oh dear, the gossiping that went on. It really was dreadful. The women neglected their homes, their children, and everything else for the whole of that week. And for months after, old Lutey was besieged by all the sick and sorry for miles and miles around, who came to him to be cured. He did such a big business in healing people that not a doctor for miles round could earn a living. Everyone went to old Lutey, and when it was found that he had power over witchcraft too, he became the most important man in the whole country. Lutey had been so rude and rough to the mermaiden when he parted from her that no one would have been surprised if she had avenged herself on him somehow and punished him severely. But no, she was true to all her promises. He got all his wishes, and neither he nor his descendants have ever come to want. Better far, though, would it have been for him had it been otherwise, for he paid dearly enough for his wishes in the end. 9 years from that very time, on a calm moonlight night, Lutey, forgetting all about the mermaid and her threats, arranged to go out with a friend to do a little fishing. There was not a breath of wind stirring, and the sea was like glass, so that a sail was useless, and they had to take to the oars. Suddenly, though, without any puff of wind or anything else to cause it, the sea rose round the boat in one huge wave, covered with a thick crest of foam, and in the midst of the foam was Morwenna. Morwenna, as lovely as ever, her arms outstretched, her clear green eyes fixed steadily, triumphantly on Lutey. She did not open her lips or make a sign. She only gazed and gazed at her victim. For a moment he looked at her as though bewildered. Then, like one bereft of his senses by some spell, he rose in the boat and turned his face towards the open sea. "My time is come," he said solemnly and sadly, and without another word to his frightened companion, he sprang out of the boat and joined the mermaid. For a yard or two, they swam in silence side by side, then disappeared beneath the waves, and the sea was as smooth again as though nothing had happened. From that moment, poor LUTEY has never been seen, nor has his body been found. Probably he now forms one of the pieces of statuary so prized by the mermaiden, and stands decked with sea blossoms, with gold heaped at his feet, or maybe, with a pair of gills slit under his chin, he swims about in their beautiful palaces and revels in the cellars of shipwrecked wines. The misfortunes to his family did not end, though, with LUTEY's disappearance, for no matter how careful they are, how far they live from the sea, or what precautions they take to protect themselves, every 9th year, one of old LUTEY's descendants is claimed by the sea.